and I would like to introduce Holly Pisa from the Urban Drainage and Flood Control District. And after that, we'll be hearing from Chris Olson from the Colorado Stormwater Center, and we appreciate their participation. They're a little bit later. Welcome to Colorado, and thank you very much.
Thanks. This is Holly Pisa. This presentation is much less technical than some of the past presentations. A lot of this information is actually taken from a 2-day course that Chris and I co-instruct to maintenance personnel and inspectors that inspect post-construction BMPs. So this is about permeable pavement maintenance, at least our experience here in Colorado. And I'm going to talk about the considerations for how frequently you maintain permeable pavement. A lot of that is dependent both on the type of pavement as well as site-specific considerations. I'm going to talk about how you identify need for maintenance and some of the equipment that may or may not be available to you for maintenance of permeable pavement. And then I'll provide a recommendation for periodic maintenance with some considerations. And Chris is going to go through some case studies in reactive maintenance. So we'll talk about wanting to maintain permeable pavement at a more periodic schedule, hopefully avoiding some of the reactive maintenance that Chris and I have both had experiences with here in Colorado. So some of the things that make certain sites more high maintenance than others is a high run-on ratio. So the area of impervious or sometimes landscaped areas that run onto permeable pavements. Also, when you have tree cover, leaves can also increase the need for maintenance of permeable pavement. We've also seen where you have landscape areas draining into permeable pavement or unstable run-on areas that it can increase required maintenance of the permeable pavement. Also, pollen can be a factor. So a little bit more on that run-on ratio, and I've heard a lot of different recommendations from different people on the recommended maximum run-on ratio, and this is what we have at the Urban Drainage Flood Control District. This is our criteria for permeable pavement run-on ratio. We use a 2-to-1 impervious run-on ratio to the area of permeable pavement. I've heard some people recommend no run-on area. The Interlocking Concrete Pavement Institute, ICPI, recommends a maximum of 5-to-1 onto permeable interlocking concrete pavement. I would agree that permeable interlocking concrete pavement might have the highest allowable run-on ratio, whereas something like porous asphalt, you really want to avoid having run-on ratio. But this is definitely a factor in how frequently you're going to need to maintain permeable pavement. Identifying when that maintenance needs to take place. And hopefully you're maintaining permeable pavement on a periodic, routine frequency. But when you see things like caked sediment on the surface, if you see a high water mark in the curb and gutter or other evidence of ponding, that's typically identifies a real need for maintenance and reduction in infiltration rates. Sediment or pollen streaks on the surface of the pavement also indicate ponding on the surface. And then for PICP, the permeable interlocking concrete pavement, also a low aggregate between the pavers. You really want to keep the aggregate up to the surface elevation of the blocks so that when sediment flows into those areas, it's trapped closer to the surface where it can be removed easier. Also, when identifying the need for that, you know, one thing that we've noticed with all BMPs, with all stormwater measures, is the black sediment that resides within the aggregate of PICP or on top of the surface of a sand filter. Another indication clearly is ponding on the surface of the pavement. And then as far as really evaluating the infiltration through the pavement, one thing that we do at the Urban Drainage and Flood Control District is use the ASTM C1701, which was written for pervious concrete, or ASTM C1781 for PICP, and we modify that in a way that I think other people modify it as well, with this weighted frame to hold the cylinder against a gasket so that you're measuring infiltration through a small area, and we weight it instead of using so much plumber putty because we don't want that residue to be left on the pavement. But this is something that definitely takes time and effort, and a lot of the inspectors that Chris and I go out and talk to, this is not something that owners are doing or inspectors. Urban Drainage recommends, and this is our rule of thumb, 20 inches per hour is what I like to see in this infiltration rate. And I know that some people have mentioned definitely a lower number, and I'll just tell you where this 20 inches per hour comes from. But we looked at our water quality event and looked at the maximum intensity during the water quality event, and we also included that run-on ratio, which is a factor, and we also included a safety factor of 2 in there. So that's how we came up with 20 inches per hour. Clearly, if you don't have a run-on ratio, it can be much lower. But we say that if you're less than 20, it's time for maintenance. So one of the things I did in preparation for this class was to go out with one of the inspectors in the Denver area and just kind of shadow them and see what a day in the life of a post-construction inspector was like. And I asked him what he did when he was inspecting permeable pavement, and he said, well, I look at it. So I thought we could probably do better than that. You can't get a sense of infiltration from just looking at it. And you're not going to get a number from pouring water on it, but pouring water on it gives you an indication of how quickly it's infiltrating. So the really quick inspection method that we tell inspectors to do is keep a gallon jug in the car and pour a gallon of water on top of the pavement, and if the wetted area exceeds 10 feet, then it's maybe time to recommend maintenance or recommend more detailed infiltration testing such as the ASTM. So moving into the type of equipment that we have available to us, and some of these more than others, I'm going to talk about 3 different kinds of sweepers. This is a broom sweeper. It's the most common. Every municipality in the Denver area has these, owns them, and many municipalities here have a good street sweeping program. But this type of sweeper is really not capable of removing sediment from the pores of the surface. It's more for larger debris and litter. I think it's good for kind of proactive maintenance, including run-on areas, to eliminate some of that sediment from the area that runs onto the permeable pavement, but it's not gonna do the job when it comes to periodic maintenance. This is really where you want to be for that routine periodic maintenance. It's a regenerative air sweeper. This is a sweeper that not all the communities in our district necessarily own, but some do. At the Urban Drainage and Flood Control District, we monitor stormwater sites and we do research, and as part of that we maintain those sites. So I've also had a little bit of difficulty finding a contractor to come and use a regenerative air sweeper on those sites. It's not impossible, but in some areas you may not have access to this type of equipment, and I think that's a good consideration when you're putting in permeable pavement. Are you going to have access to the right equipment to maintain it? So regenerative air sweepers they don't actually use a vacuum at the surface of the pavement, but it uses a blast of air perpendicular to the direction that it's driving for the width of the vehicle, and that dislodges material from the surface and then lifts it up into an airstream. And this is really, again, where you want to be for that routine periodic maintenance. We have had issues with some smaller sites. This is the office of a landscape architect who got very creative with putting trees in the middle of the PICP, and it's really just a small parking lot. And he's not able to find someone to come with a regenerative air vacuum and maintain it. There are walk-behind vacuums, and this is one that may or may not be easy to find where you are. This took me a while to find a company that would come out and maintain their pavement. And what we found was that this is good for periodic maintenance. This is a vacuum at the surface of the PICP, but it wouldn't be adequate if you really didn't maintain the pavement and allowed it to clog and had to remove the aggregate between the blocks. Some other equipment that we've used, and Chris will talk about this a little bit more with the case studies, is this vacuum / pressure washer, vacuum hydro scrubber, and these are not all of these are created equally. They have different pressures, different suction associated with them. And the thing I would say about these is you really want to be careful, especially with PICP. The ICPI doesn't recommend pressure washing for PICP because it has a problem with moving sediment down further into the pavement. I've had a lot of luck with this type of maintenance on very clogged porous asphalts, which I never thought could be restored. But I think what I want to say about this is that all permeable pavements, the maintenance of permeable pavement is much more about the vacuuming and the suction than it is on pressure washing. So water can really help dislodge some of that sediment, but if you don't have a vacuum at the same time, you're just going to push sediment down into the pavement. So this is equipment that can be used for periodic maintenance as well as reactive maintenance. And then the third type of sweepers is the pure vacuum sweeper, and I don't know that I can find any contractor within the Denver area and get them to come out and use a pure vacuum sweeper. They're just not very common, at least here they're not. But this can be used for reactive maintenance when you really kind of abuse the pavement and don't maintain it for a long period of time. This can be used to actually remove the aggregate between the blocks of the PICP, and it can be used to restore other pavements as well. We have done that with pervious concrete. I do want to go back, and I've said this a number of times now, you really want to be at a level of periodic maintenance, and it is very dependent on what type of pavement you have, right? I talked about that. If it's porous asphalt, it's going to be a little bit more high maintenance than PICP. So what type of pavement you have, also site-specific factors. Do you have a high run-on ratio? That means more maintenance. Do you have, or higher frequency of maintenance? Do you have trees? Do you have pollen? Do you have an area that's not stable running onto the pavement? That can all mean an increased frequency of maintenance. So my recommendation would be to start with a regenerative air vacuum twice per year. Here we do it typically, on my sites we do it in April and we do it in October, and then really monitor it and see if you can adjust it either way. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Chris.
All right, thanks Holly. What I want to talk about a little bit are some case studies of reactive maintenance that we have experienced here in Colorado. Myself at Colorado State University, along with Holly at Urban Drainage Flood Control District, and the City of Fort Collins have actively searching for some methods for remediating pavements that have clogged or experienced very low infiltration rates because of a lack of periodic maintenance. So some of the case studies I'm going to go over are highlighted here in this slide. Most of these are somewhere between 5 and 10 years old, had very little or no periodic maintenance prior to us determining that they were clogged and needed what we call reactive maintenance. Like I said, these three organizations listed here have been working together, and most of these findings that I'm going to talk about today we've really just experienced within the last year or two. First site I'm going to talk about here is PICP, Permeable Interlocking Concrete Pavers. This was a site in Fort Collins that we went out and tested using the ASTM methods that Holly talked about previously, measured the infiltration rates, and they were down to about 5 inches per hour, an average of 5 inches per hour. We did multiple tests, and the first thing we thought was, okay, we'll bring in regenerative air sweeper and see how that works. And we went over it a couple of different passes. You can see the picture here. And then we went in and measured infiltration rates afterwards, and we noticed that there was really no difference. So that helped us come to the conclusion that regen air sweepers are not really effective or appropriate for trying to restore a clogged PICP site. These pictures are from a same test that Holly did down in Denver, and they didn't necessarily measure. They didn't have to measure infiltration rates here because just a visual test of this site showed that the regen air sweeper did not remove the caked sediment from the surface. We also tried pressure washing on these PICP sites. This picture is from one of Holly's sites down in Denver, and we did this also in Fort Collins. And as you can see in this picture, you can see that the sediment, the pressure washing, is dislodging some of the surface sediment. And if you continued, pressure washing, you could push that sediment, to the curb and gutter, where what they were doing here was pushing the sediment to the curb and gutter, and then they had a vacuum hose right here that they were sucking up the water and the sediment. So it appeared to be effective, but then when we went and measured infiltration rates using this test again in Fort Collins, we found that the infiltration rates actually decreased after doing pressure washing, and we think that that's because although we were dislodging some surface sediment, we were also pushing that sediment further down into the base layer and creating below ground sediment cake layer, if you will. ICPI also does not recommend this, so just something to consider. We also tested on these same sites this sidewalk cleaner, or vacuum hydro scrubber, as we've come up with the non-technical name of. And again, we did pre and post maintenance infiltration rates and found that this particular method was not effective on PICP. Now, in a few slides, I'm going to talk about that actually this was effective for other types of pavement. Each of those methods that I just talked about, really are only effective at, we think are only effective at removing sediment from maybe an inch or two below the surface in the joints. And so Holly talked about this a little bit, but it's really important to keep the joints of PICP filled with whatever the specifications of aggregate are. Around here it's a number 89 stone, and that way as the runoff moves through the joints, this aggregate filters the sediment out at the surface so that we may be able to go back in with periodic maintenance. We can use those methods and remove the sediment while it's at the surface, versus, I know for example the Fort Collins site, the aggregate had settled and moved at least an inch if not 2 inches below the surface and had never been refilled since its installation, and so that just allowed the sediment to migrate and get trapped further at a deeper depth that those methods could not remove it from. So this is a really important periodic maintenance consideration so that you may be able to use those other methods, the regen air vacuum, the vacuum hydro scrubber, to maintain PICP more periodically and not have to go through, not let it get to the point of reactive maintenance. This is, we've had a couple presenters talk about, proper specifications, and this is just a, sort of another instance of if you don't properly specify whatever aggregate you need, whether it's for the subbase or for filling the joints, that you could have problems. In this case here in Colorado, we have the options of having river rock, very well rounded, and we also have granite fractured faces, and the specifications call for fractured faces, but we've seen instances where we ended up getting river rock instead. So just keep in mind on inspecting the delivery of all the aggregates that you receive. So getting back to the PICP sites, we tried all those other methods and still could not restore the PICP. So what we did in Fort Collins, well, I'll get to in the next slide, but what we're showing here is, again, kind of reiterating how far this sediment can move into the subbase. If you don't keep the joints filled, what we found as we went and removed the pavers and started measuring to see how far the sediment had accumulated, it was deeper than 4 inches below the surface. And none of those methods, the regen air sweeper, vacuum hydro scrubber, etc., really have enough vacuum power to remove sediment from such deep depths. So after 6 years of operation without maintenance at this site and a very low infiltration rate of less than 2 inches per hour, the city decided to go in and manually remove all of the pavers and take a skid steer and remove all of the bedding course, the number 89 bedding course where the sediment was trapped. This is the number 89 bedding course that we're talking about. This is the same material that you would use to fill the joints. And removed all that bedding course and replaced it with brand new bedding course. And that cost about $1 per square foot. This facility was about 7,000 or 8,000 square feet, and it took roughly 3 or 4 days to complete the whole job. But afterwards we went in and did our infiltration test again, and we had very typical greater than 100 inches per hour of infiltration rates for PICP, which is very typical of a brand new installation. So this worked, and the good news is that if you do ignore your PICP sites and it becomes clogged, you can restore it. It's not necessarily cheap, $1 per square foot, but it is possible to restore that. We also had a few instances where we had porous concrete and porous asphalt sites that had become clogged. This is another site in Denver, porous asphalt that had been clogged, and Holly went and tested out this vacuum hydro scrubber and found that it did actually restore the infiltration rates. Prior to maintenance, I think the infiltration rates were less than 1 inch per hour, and after going through and performing this method, the infiltration rates were about 24 inches per hour. You'll see there's some specs here in terms of Holly had mentioned that not all of these are created equal, and so for this particular application we asked the contractor what the specs were in terms of pressure washing and vacuuming, and these were the specs that they gave us: about 3,500 psi and 110 cubic feet per minute of suction. It's hard to tell in this photo, but these jets that act to pressure wash the surface are actually at about a 45-degree angle. So it's not pressure washing directly straight down into the surface, but more of it at an angle to sort of dislodge the surface sediments. And this cost about 35 cents per square foot. Not too long after Holly figured that out, we had a porous concrete site in Fort Collins that was about 6 or 7 years old and was operating very well, still had a very high infiltration rate, but then we experienced a water main break within the parking lot, and it sent a whole bunch of water and sediment directly into the parking lot, and in 12 hours created a completely clogged porous asphalt or porous concrete site. The owners in the city were pretty concerned about this and thought that they were going to have to completely replace it, but we went in and tested that same vacuum hydro scrubber, and we did the infiltration rates again before and after and found that we were able to restore from less than 3 inches per hour to over 30 inches per hour by using that same method. Again, and this is just kind of to reiterate about pressure washing, because that vacuum hydro scrubber does have a pressure washing component to it, but it also has the vacuuming, and we think that that's more important of a component than the pressure washing. We do think that adding some water helps to dislodge the sediments, but it may not be necessary. If we can find some technology that would add a little bit of water, not necessarily as a pressure washing, but just add some water to help dislodge the sediments and then apply a vacuum, we think that that would also be successful, but we just haven't found that technology yet. Holly mentioned about the pier vacuum trucks. These are very difficult to find. I think all we know of here in Colorado is that CDOT has these. Holly was able to procure one of these to test on a clogged porous concrete site and found that it worked very well also. But it is very slow. You have to go over it a couple of different times, and it's essentially about 2 parking spaces per hour. And it costs somewhere around 50-60 cents per square foot to do this. Again, it's probably very difficult to even get access to one of these unless maybe some very particular situations. I just want to finish off a few more slides on other maintenance considerations that we discuss in our workshop. We have a lot of systems with under drains here in Colorado, and so we stress that the inspectors go in and make sure that those under drains are capped and protected from any type of damage so that we're not short-circuiting water directly into the under drain. In terms of weed management and stain removal, if you have weeds or vegetation growing in your permeable pavement, it's probably a sign that you need to do some maintenance, because the vegetation is usually only going to grow if there is sediment built up. But if you do have some weeds, we prefer and recommend to not use chemicals. Obviously, we're not trying to add any additional pollutants. Holly likes to use a torch and just flame the weeds. That seems to be pretty effective. Doesn't require any additional chemicals. And then you can obtain some biodegradable degreasers if stains become an issue. And it's recommended to, at least according to the permit here in Colorado, that you can't wash that degreaser back into the pavement, but you should wipe it up with a towel or something else so that you're not adding, again, pollutants to the groundwater. In terms of snow control, obviously here in Colorado we have our fair share of snow, and some of the things that we recommend is, first of all, to never sand any type of permeable pavement. The primary issue there is that sands that are used for traction control during the winter are not clean and washed, and so there's a lot of very fine silts, clays, and other sediments that will clog your permeable pavement system very fast. This middle picture here was a PICP installation that was brand new, less than a year old. You can see evidence of sanding, and then you can also see evidence of standing water. This is a perfect example of why we don't want to sand permeable pavement. It's a good idea not to store snow on permeable pavement. Again, snow piles have a very high sediment content, and as that snow melts, it will end up clogging the pavement in that area. Any type of chemical de-icers, well, they should not be used on porous concrete, because that can actually break down the binding materials, porous concrete, and create some structure issues. And then we've had a few instances where PICP pavers have settled a little bit unevenly, and if you try to plow those systems with a metal cutting snow blade, you actually can rip some of those pavers up, and we've had some examples of that here. So the other thing we recommend is to use a rubber cutting edge if you are going to plow any type of permeable pavement, but especially PICP. And then it's also a good idea, if you can, to place some signage that warns not to sand or use chemical degreasers or seal coat if you have a porous asphalt site. That's our presentation. Here is our contact information and our websites, Urban Drainage Flood Control District and then the Stormwater Center at CSU. And I think with that, we'll take some questions.
Thank you very much, Holly and Chris. Maintenance and ops are always the most frequently raised issues, and you raised a lot of very good points, and we also appreciate your sharing what doesn't always go well as opposed to what does go well, because that's very instructive for learning. So thank you. So Jeff asked, for the paver rehab project, were the existing pavers just reused?
Yes, they were.
Thank you. Anybody else have questions? No, we may be running out of steam after 3 hours. Well, if anybody has questions, please direct them to the Stormwater Center. We'll make sure that they get to Holly and Chris. So at this point, if we don't have any other questions, I want to thank all of our speakers. You were fabulous.